Good evening. I'm Kristine Brancolini, Dean of the William H. Hannon Library. I will be the moderator this evening for the panel discussion, The Role of Student Journalism in Restorative Justice. Our panelists will discuss the role of student journalism in the world following the murders of Black men and women this past summer and the protests that followed, and the 2020 election, which seems to have never ended on a certain level. Student journalists have a unique opportunity to reconcile the public's trust and to reimagine how journalism can heal communities in recovery from politically divisive in a politically divisive era. Student and professional journalists sometimes disagree about newsroom objectivity, the response of student publications to events like Black Lives Matter protests last summer, and their commitment to representation in the newsroom. In a recent article in the Columbia Journalism Review entitled College Newsrooms Challenge an Industry Status Quo, editor Holden Foreman from the Stanford Daily noted, "The purpose of journalism is not to reflect public discourse in a perfectly objective way, but to inform the community by reporting the truth." So tonight we have two student editors and a journalism professor in conversation. The chat box is open. Please use it to share your ideas with the panelists and each other. The Q&A box is also open, so please put your questions there as you think of them. We will have a conversation, and then around 7:45, we will shift from the moderated section of the program to pose your questions to the panelists. Our panelists are Alyssa Story from the Los Angeles Loyolan, Raven Yamamoto, an editor and one of the founders of Agency LMU, and Kevin Curran, clinical assistant professor of journalism and communication studies at Loyola Marymount University. They will introduce themselves and their work to you, and then we will begin the conversation. Don't forget to drop your questions in the Q&A box for later. So first, let's start off with Alyssa. Can't hear you, Alyssa.
I think my internet cut out just a little bit, but
Okay, there you go.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Alyssa Story. I'm a sophomore journalism and film media and television studies double major from Minneapolis, which is where I'm zooming from today. And as Ms. said, I'm the editor-in-chief of the Los Angeles Loyolan. The Loyolan is one of the university student-run news sources. We publish in 6 sections: news. We even have a satirical section called The Bluff, and a cartoon, video, and photographer. So essentially any type of news gathering we can do. We are coming up on our 100th year of being in publication, which to me is insane, but very awesome. And the Loyolan's mission has and always will be to serve the student body as a news gathering organization with an ultimate goal of pursuing the truth without special interest and always being fair. Personally, I have always loved journalism. I consider myself to be a storyteller, and I started with student journalism in high school. And I came to want to pursue it professionally because, I value the truth, and I really think that a compelling and honest story can have, a lot of power, challenging perspectives and starting conversations. So excited to be here. Thank you.
Excellent, welcome. Raven.
Hi, everybody. My name is Raven Yamamoto. I am the founder and editor-in-chief of Agency LMU. I'm actually also a very, very recent alum. I graduated in December with my bachelor's in journalism and a minor in poli-sci. I'm really excited to be here with Alyssa. I'm excited to have this conversation between our two outlets. And Agency LMU is a independent student news publication that was founded almost exactly 1 year ago. We're celebrating our 1-year anniversary. We met for the first time on January 22nd of last year. So it's pretty insane to be able to say that, but we were founded on 2 basic principles. One of them was centering Black, Indigenous, and other voices of color in journalism here at LMU, and the other was holding power to account. And so those are the 2 driving values that have gotten us this far. So we must be doing something right. And I'm just super excited to share.
Great, excellent. Next up, Kevin. You're muted, Kevin.
Thank you, Dean Brancolini. I joined the journalism faculty at LMU back in August after completing my PhD at the University of Oklahoma. I also have an MBA from Arizona State and a bachelor's from the Jesuit University in New York, Fordham University. I come to academia after a career in journalism, mostly in broadcast. I started in radio when I was on Long Island, worked for New York radio stations in New York City, Radio Network, New York and Washington, on to Phoenix for some radio management positions. And then I spent 19 years as a television assignment editor in Tucson, Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Oklahoma City. So I've had the ability to look at journalism, both radio, television, online, and watch the industry go through a lot of changes over the years.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's dive right in. And this is a question for the students. What is the role of student journalism on a college campus in helping to revitalize trust in credible sources of information, particularly in this environment where we've seen the proliferation of news organizations that propagate lies and disinformation?
Yeah, I can answer that. I think specifically for the Loyolan, we're a local paper. We serve a small and specific community, something that in media is becoming more and more rare. And so I think as a student journalist and college papers as a whole have a unique opportunity to be very invested in the communities that we serve in a way that like national media coverage isn't, which for us, the community we serve is the campus and its students. So at the Loyolan, we kind of follow three founding principles of accuracy, relevancy, and responsibility. And, we keep accuracy first because that is the most important thing of what we do. And, the best way to revitalize trust is to be trustworthy. And so over the past 4 years, at least, all of us have seen faith in journalism and the media at large kind of wavering. And so any force of like misinformation or even the mislabeling of an opinion piece as news kind of chips away at that trust. And that trust is foundational to what all of us do. And so we, maintain that commitment to being accurate. And, we start small and we're not perfect. Everyone's, is imperfect, but we take that responsibility seriously. And I think that can grow outside of the college campus as people leave and are used to trusting their local media source.
Yeah, to
Raven.
follow up. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, Raven, what would you like to add?
I think Alyssa put it very well. I just think that student journalism is absolutely vital to the community that we have here at LMU. I think it is I think that we all have to obviously remember that no one knows what students want, need, or care about more than students themselves. And so when students are doing the reporting, they're doing the best reporting because obviously they are reporting on a community that they are represented in and want to be represented in. I think student journalism also serves as a counter to, say, university PR or campus news written by people that are not students because they don't understand what we want, even though we are what makes the campus so great as well. I think that especially with Agency's point of view, which is having a specific audience and to stand for and by marginalized students, that's also important to explicitly say that we are a space for that and that it is a platform for not just us, but others who look and walk through life like us.
And, how do you think that your two publications complement each other in that regard? Because as you've expressed to me, you have sort of a different mission. And could you just briefly mention that before we sort of go deeper?
Yeah, I think more is always better. I personally don't think you can have too many news sources on a campus. I think having more than one perspective in itself is wonderful. And both are we have the same mission and the same end goal. We're just accomplishing it in different ways. There are just so many different students. We have such a diverse student body that makes it so strong and vibrant that there can never be too many news sources, I don't think, to represent each voice. So I just think the more the merrier.
Absolutely. And, I think it's kind of, awesome and special that we have each other to hold ourselves accountable. If someone's not picking up the right story, there's another news source saying, look, we should pay attention to this too. And that is so that's important for any campus. And the fact that LMU is able to have two news sources, one that's very much that, you know, traditional news coverage. We cover the sporting games, we cover like what's happening in the dining hall, stuff like that. And then also have an organization that's committed to that advocacy journalism that can be sometimes missing in the very kind of classical objective journalism. I think it's very important. And I think, like Raven was saying, it provides for a lot of different voices to be heard, which is our both of our end goals. Yeah.
Great.
Could I also really
yeah, go
quick,
ahead.
sorry, I also wanted to give a shout out to Black at LMU magazine. I know that they recently started, and I'd love to just plug their title real quick as they generate more content, because they're also up and coming, and I'm super excited to see what they do.
Okay, great. John Jackson is popping some links in the chat. And so if we have a link for that publication, that would be great too, or we can add it later. Kevin, so what do you think should be the role of student journalism? What role do you think it plays in kind of the educational process?
It plays some very important roles. Those of you who attended Wolf Blitzer's event prior to this one heard him talk about how this is where the journalists of tomorrow learn their craft. The best advice he would give a journalism student was to just keep practicing and watching. And it's important, especially on a diverse urban campus like ours, to have the two voices. I know at Fordham we had the RAM, which, like the Loyolan, was the paper that's been around almost as long as the university, and then we had an alternative publication called The Paper. But even in New York City, yes, you've got the New York Times, you've got the New York Daily News, you've got the New York Post, you also have the Village Voice. You have the Los Angeles Times, and you have LA Weekly.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody has to represent those the people who want the more in-depth story, or the story that accents the people who aren't ordinarily heard from. Not that the Loyolan is old and stodgy in its ways, because it's not, but they have a mission that is slightly different from the agency, because Loyolan is the paper of record of the university and agency is not. If you want to find out what happened on this campus 50 years ago, there's bound copies of the Loyolan somewhere that can tell them that. And 50 years from now, people will look at Alyssa's copies of the Loyolan and say, boy, she really did a good job.
Which makes me realize we should be archiving Agency LMU also, Raven. We should talk about that.
But I think to your specific point, we get this idea in the interconnected age that anybody can do news, the concept of the citizen journalist. And that is, it's not compatible, because to be a journalist means that you are not only curious, and you not only have the ability to write a story in a certain way, it also means that you're living up to a set of standards. The Society of Professional Journalists have a code of ethics. The Radio, Television, Digital News Association has a code of ethics. The National Press Photographers Association has a code of ethics. And you should be guided by those to know how to tell your story. And you should be figuring out, reporters work sources. Reporters keep their ears to the ground. Reporters see something and say, why is it that way? And then they go out and find out why. And it's that kind of training that they get in college journalism that makes them good journalists when they hit the career field.
Okay. So the next question, based on your experiences, what changes would you like to see in mainstream journalism? And are there ways in which student journalism can help bring about changes for the better in mainstream/professional journalism? Thoughts on that? Raven. Alyssa, what do you think?
I'll go. Alyssa bit the bullet the first time. I think there has been a lot of conversation about change in the mainstream media as of late, especially as of last year. Specifically during the summer, I think journalism had a massive reckoning with race and still is in need of one. I think even after this past summer, where there was a big push to prioritize Black writers and journalists and other journalists of color, that there is still so much work to be done. It's a start, I think, is what I'm trying to get at. That's where my head is. I remember when the LA Times posted or released that series of articles, Our Reckoning with Racism, I believe, and it was a series of articles dedicated to sort of addressing the racism that has occurred in their newsroom that affected their coverage. But even after that, you see threads on Twitter or people coming forward who still currently work there about their negative experiences as people of color. So while the conversation has started, it needs to be continued. And I guess I would say the change is that I want to make sure that conversation doesn't die. It's very easy for that to lose momentum when people lose interest in being an activist or an advocate. So I think it's up to us as student journalists who are learning and ready and have all this energy to keep pushing that and keeping the momentum up.
Alyssa, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Raven. I think, they're right. This summer, we saw a very big push in bringing to the forefront these conversations about race. And that's something that at least I hadn't seen in my time as, being involved in journalism. I also think, there needs to be work done to challenge what we view as responsible journalism. I think sometimes we kind of allow the idea of objectivity or, getting both sides in a way that is harmful rather than healing. And so I think that is something that starts on campuses like we're doing now and spreads to the CNNs and everything. I think journalists just need to be diligent and remain intentional about the work that they're doing. And yeah.
Kevin, what are your thoughts about that?
The questions that Alyssa and Raven brought up are definitely on the front mind of journalism managers all across the country. There was a brilliant op-ed piece written by Wes Lowry in the New York Times last year called A Reckoning Over Objectivity. And Wes won a Pulitzer Prize with the Washington Post for his work on developing a database on officer-involved shootings because the federal government doesn't keep one. And what Wes pointed out is that there is a problem with representation, that newsrooms are not diverse enough. And if the staff doesn't have the learned experience of growing up Black or Hispanic or growing up on the wrong side of the tracks, then it makes it hard for them to report the story. The other thing that is important and that I like to remind students a lot is they have to have an open view as to what positions they're seeking when they hit the job market. There are organizations like the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, the National Association of Black Journalists, the Asian American Journalists Association, who hold annual meetings and bring in recruiters from companies. And I remember being at a dinner with two major market television news directors who talked about their most recent experience at one of those meetings. And one of them remarked that everybody who came up to his table was looking for an on-air position. And in television, if you want to affect change, becoming a reporter is not the way to do it. He said if they were applying for producer roles, they could be running the joint in 5 years. So you really need to think about, if you're going into the journalism industry, what position do you want to take that can help best represent, bring your voice to the table? And it's not a question of objectivity. You can't, that is an essential goal of journalism, is that you can't be taking sides in a story. But you also have to make sure that the story accurately reflects what's really going on.
Alyssa or Raven, any follow-up to that comment? No?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely true. And, you know, diversity in our newsroom is essential at the Loyola, and we always work to empower like writers of color. And I think that is one of the most important things, not just to have that representation in your newsroom, but to allow those people to really flourish and thrive and be leading voices in the newsroom. And so I totally agree. And I think that's something that needs to be happening, all throughout the journalism industry, not just having, a Black on air anchor, but Black producers or producers of color, and really challenging, what we see.
By the way, John Jackson dropped the link to that New York Times op-ed about objectivity into the chat. So interesting. Raven, do you have anything that you'd like to add about that? I'm just curious about the concept of how student journalists can try to change the orientation and as Kevin, how do you get influence, when you're breaking into the business and that sort of thing. Maybe it's the publication where you work. I mean, I would say in our business, where you go to work in a library makes a difference. And I'm sure that where you go to work as a journalist makes a difference. Who's more open to your point of view and to a different way of looking at covering the news, et cetera? Raven?
Yeah, I really wanted to just like emphasize something that Alyssa said, which was wonderful. And it's about like having writers of color, people of color in like leadership positions.
Yes.
So not just like sitting there, like met a quota, but like actually giving their voice and giving a platform to their voice, which is super important to us as well. I mean, I hate the excuse like, oh, I couldn't find any, writers or journalists of color for this job, or nobody applied. Well, I mean, maybe they haven't been taught how to properly apply for a job. I know I had to learn that myself, and it was really, really hard. I still almost struggled to write a cover letter. So there are things that we have to remember, I think, that are barriers to access to even applying for those jobs, and then believing in yourself enough to apply for the job as well. So thinking that you can be on TV like is also a really hard thing that many people struggle with. And it's just about, on a student level, especially, like going and making the effort to find those people, like actively looking around and being like, oh, I wonder if this person would be interested in writing. Let me go to a club meeting maybe and like talk to them and ask them if there's anything that they are concerned about that we should, be tackling, So it's a constant, I would say, outreach and a constant reevaluation of our own biases, our own ideas of what we think is newsworthy and how we can oftentimes be wrong. So stepping out of that bubble and stepping outside of ourselves.
I would say that I've been impressed lately by the youth of many of the reporters and commentators of color that I see on CNN and MSNBC. I think they're seeking out young talent. I mean, I see people who are under 30, and it kind of amazes me. And I'm blanking on her name right now. There's a new young woman on CNN who they just brought on who was amazing, and she was like the only person of color basically covering the election. And then the next thing I know, they've made her some sort of an anchor on some of the programs. So anyway, I just think that they're looking for talent, and you can be the ones who fill when they say we can't find people of color to fill these positions. Well, you're the experienced people who can fill those positions for them. So I think working on how you show what you can do at LMU and then take that out into the world. So next question. Just like libraries and archives, journalism entails curation and selection. Make choices about which topics to cover and how to approach those topics. How can curation and selection of stories be part of rebuilding our communities?
I think I can go first on that one. It kind of bounces off what I said earlier too. So I think for curation or selection, I think very similarly, like I think me and Alyssa both obviously see this environment where we all kind of get together as a staff and we're like, all right, what are people talking about? And so just kind of getting input from our amazing, wonderful writers that have are part of like so many different circles. So definitely finding out what is a common theme, but at the same time, trying to find a balance of what is something that we haven't heard very much of. Obviously, what everyone's buzzing about is super important. And like, that's obviously news by like definition. But what are the things that we're like, oh, wait, I had no idea about that. And I think many other people don't know what's going on with that either. I think a really good example was something that I was made aware of that I was not previously aware of in a newsroom setting that we took on as a story was the Armenia and Azerbaijani conflict, and the students of the Armenian diaspora that are on our campus, or I guess virtually, who were organizing to send thousands of dollars in aid to Armenia. And I had no idea about that. And I thought that was such a problem. So it was so great to be able to talk to them. They were on our news podcast, The Addendum, and they did an incredible job. And it was so great to have them tell their story to our audience. And we like to think that it made a bit of an impact in at least spreading awareness on the topic. So things like that, like I would never have guessed. A lot of people in our newsroom had no idea because there's always going to be stories that are so important that are going to be outside of our circle no matter what. So just constantly trying to look for things that aren't necessarily low-hanging fruit per se, and making an effort as well.
Raven, that's a really interesting example, because there are many, many Armenians in Los Angeles. There are more Armenians in LA than any other city. So that's and we have Armenians on campus. And I just think it's really an interesting example of, a national story that has an international story, frankly, that has a lot of interest in our community. That's a good example. Alyssa, sorry, you got bumped out, but would you like to respond about selection and curation of stories?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Do you mind restating the question you asked?
Sure, I'm sorry. So here's the question. Just like libraries and archives, journalism entails curation and selection. You make choices about which topics to cover and how to approach those topics. How can the curation and selection of stories be part of rebuilding our communities?
Yes, absolutely. I think, that conversation is part of exactly what we've kind of been touching on, in that representation really matters in the newsroom and in those leadership positions. Because what is newsworthy to one person may not be newsworthy to another. And so understanding when you have a diverse newsroom, not only in identity, but also in interest and in background, it allows for you to really be able to pick up on all the different areas of what's happening on campus. So it really, I think it starts in the newsroom. And if you're responsibly choosing people to work and empowering them to say, like, this is what I think is important, let's go after this, then you're set up for success. So I think, yeah, being intentional, it's always just like having intention and really critically thinking about what you're choosing to publish. And so, yeah.
Kevin, how did that, tell us a little bit about the job that you did where you were an assignment editor. How does that work, and so this was like probably your whole job, trying to figure out what to cover and who to cover it and how to cover it.
Exactly. The assignment editor's job is to know what the news is before it's the news. It's where most stories start. So it could be a phone call. Phone never stops ringing. It could be an email, easily 1,000 emails a day. It could be a police radio and just listening for the right address, the right tone, the right units. Any of that comes in to say, okay, this looks like something to put in the dish. My role is kind of like to be the buffet chef. Here's the chafing dish of the fire. Here's the chafing dish of the politician squirming out of something. Here's the chafing dish of this really cute animal story. And now you're the producer of the 5 o'clock newscast, the 6 o'clock newscast, the 10 o'clock newscast. Which of these dishes do you want, and how much do you want? Are you going to assign it to a reporter? Are you going to take it from the network? Are you going to just send a photographer to go out and get a quick piece of video? however that works. Every outlet has a target market. You know, it's pretty obvious for the Loyolan and Agency what they are, because it's the students of LMU. The Agency has a slightly different focus. What I would program for a Spanish speaking news station in Los Angeles is different than what I would suggest for an English speaking newscast in Phoenix. And, every station, every network has an image of what their target market is. And then it's just a case of, okay, once you've got the story, how do you tell the story? What angles do you want to tell? In the early days of the pandemic, it was prevention, it was closures, it was masks, because that's what we knew. But then the public health people, who are some of the most overworked people in government even before this, started reporting that it's really affecting communities of color. I'm coming to you from Scottsdale, Arizona. The pandemic has done an awful job in the Native American communities, especially the Navajo Reservation. And now that those statistics are coming in, now is the time to go out and get those stories. And especially,
We lost you. We can't hear you. I don't know why, Kevin. We lost your audio. Can't hear you. I think he's frozen. Life in the internet, life in the world of Zoom. Okay. I think we get the idea, because that was the whole point of it, sort of the way in which, something, you're covering breaking news, and the next thing you know, there's a deeper story that you need to follow up with. So, okay, you're back. You're back through audio.
sorry about that. But what I was saying is, that's when you start, and hopefully you find people in the community who can give you the firsthand stories about what's happening. And, you want to develop a good network of sources, of people who will trust you and call you and tell you what's going on, so that, you don't end up being caught unawares or getting accused of ignoring something.
Okay, great. The next question I want to pose to the students is about an issue or an event that you both covered and how you may have covered it differently. What are the implications for the campus community in these different approaches? And the story that I had posed to you was, or the issue that I had posed to you was the removal of the Father Sarah statue from the Vonderau building last summer, or whenever it happened, we're not sure, but it was noticed actually by Agency last July, and then subsequently covered by the Loyolan and Agency. So could you talk a little bit about that? It's an interesting issue, and I think it has a restorative justice perspective.
Yeah.
Raven, you broke it, so.
Yeah, that was a really interesting moment, I think, to study student reactions to that. That was very important, I thought, to give a platform to specifically our very newly established Indigenous Student Union, who had been, or at least members of the union before it had become like an official organization, had been advocating against having on campus. So it definitely was within our beat of looking at social justice on like our campus and what that looks like. And so what was the only reason we actually found out about that was because somebody came forward to be like, hey, just saying, you should look into this. And I was like, oh, really? And so it felt like a moment of validation for us, feeling like people that you could approach with that sort of information. And as we kind of, made our rounds with sources and got people who were near campus to safely confirm that it was gone. I mean, we published it, and it was a really interesting reaction. A lot of discussion started coming around that. And this is what I think Alyssa was mentioning earlier, was that where we kind of fill in the gaps of each other. So we actually didn't cover the part where the university announced that they were going to be putting it back, the Loyolan did. And obviously we have like very limited resources at the agency. We're not paid, we don't have a salary. And so sometimes we miss things. And that's where I think it's awesome that the Loyolan was able to pick that up and continue that narrative to make sure it was documented, because that's what we're here to do. And I thought it was an actual cool product of like teamwork almost, in a way.
Yeah. And Alyssa, talk a little bit about this issue as well, because you also covered, you know, the ASLMU resolution and the Indigenous Student Union resolution. So could you talk, so that's another aspect, sort of what is the official university, you know, what were the student demands, and then, you know, those sorts of things.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good example of just kind of our goal of creating that rounded news coverage of covering, you know, here's what the students are saying, here's what the Indigenous Student Union is saying, here's what the university has said, and trying to get all the stories as it was developing. You know, I agree with what Raven said, like it's definitely an example of teamwork. They really came through with that, bringing the story to attention, especially a story that may have not have been picked up because the Indigenous Student Union was new, and that those types of stories are often, you know, put to the wayside for reasons that we've discussed. But I think, yeah, I think we covered it as well as we could as it developed. We published an opinion piece on it after producing our news, and you know, that's the goal, to just try to get all the information out, and as things happen and change, just keeping people informed. Yeah.
I also liked the way you brought in faculty members to talk about it in a broader context, and also to consider ideas for what might, you know, what might be done with the statute. You know, you know, where it might go and how it might become, you know, part of an educational conversation, but not, you know, a hero, but you know, part of our history that is not, you know, a positive thing. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting. I think the two publications together gave a very full coverage and a lot of context to the entire issue, and used the statute as a catalyst to explore, you know, the wider range of issues around Indigenous people in California. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
and to add, oh, sorry.
No, you go, Alyssa, you go.
I was gonna say, I think the statue situation was also, you know, a good example of like how sometimes we get kind of caught in binaries of like there's people for the statue and against, but really that situation was so multifaceted. You know, there's people, like you said, faculty members who research on topics like this, people who didn't approve of what Father Sarah did, but, you know, like the statue, people who didn't. And so I think when you have all those perspectives converging on the same topic, it's really important to make sure that you're at least kind of touching on the fact that it's more than just like yes and no. There's a whole bunch of in between, and that's the full story.
Yes, 100%. And I also wanted to point out that, you know, ISU's demands have still not been addressed by the university. They haven't been necessarily invited to a meeting like they've requested to. And so it's an ongoing issue that like me and Alyssa and our newsrooms are going to cover. And now that we've been made aware of it, we're not going to let it go. I think there's a larger conversation too. I mean, in talking to some sources from ISU, I mean, they pointed out 100% that there is no Indigenous student services. There's no Native student services. And that promotes a larger conversation that we wouldn't have, I don't think, without, you know, giving a platform to ISU's voices that have been ignored historically, I think, at this university.
That's a really good point. And I do think that it has become a catalyst for conversation. I mean, I imagine that there are many students who walked by that statue, which has been on campus for decades, and didn't even really know who that person was. I mean, if you're from California, you know who Father Sarah is, and you might even recognize the statue. But if you're not, you don't know who that person is, most likely, and you don't know the role that he played in the history of California. As a native Angelino, I knew exactly who that person was when I saw the statue. Yeah, it's really interesting. And you know, those of you who are new on campus, the Vondra building used to be the library. So when I first came to campus, before we built the new William H. Hannon Library, the Vondra was the Vondra Library. So that statue stood outside the library. Kevin, what what would you like to add to this? Can you give us an example from your experience about a decision making, sort of choosing how to, a topic that is could be covered from multiple different ways, and it might go in one direction for a while, and then you might realize, kind of like you were talking about the whole COVID-19 situation, but there might be other topics that in your career you've dealt with.
Well, I wanted to first point out, as Raven said, remember I said about the student journalists have to have their fingers on the pulse of the campus, and all the phone calls and emails that I would get, 99 and 44/100% of them is stuff that I'm never going to touch. But every once in a while, we had a call. I wasn't on duty that morning. Somebody called the assignment desk of the station I was working at and asked why there were police cars in front of the house of the bishop of the Catholic Diocese of Phoenix. And we didn't know why there were police cars in front of the house of the bishop. And of course, they sent a photographer right up. And sure enough, these cops keep coming. And then they open the garage door, and there's the bishop's car in the garage with this huge gash in the front window. And then the bishop gets walked out of the house, given a seat in the front of an unmarked car, and driven away. And it turned out that the bishop had been involved in a fatal hit and run, of which he
Wow.
was later convicted. But it all started from that one phone call. And there was a lot of analysis then too, because as I said, the bishop was walked out of the house, suspicion of committing a major felony, no handcuffs, given the front seat in the unmarked car, not the plastic back seat behind the cage in the patrol car. It was a really interesting thing to see happen. The one thing that, Raven also pointed out about looking for the Armenian community members. You always go looking for places where you can find the best reaction to something. And when a pope dies, you go to the nearest Catholic church or cathedral, and you try to find Catholics who would know who the Pope is, and what they felt about him and his papacy, and what they hope for in the new Pope. That would be a hard question to ask just on the street or in front of a Lutheran church. But we were in the aftermath of the George Zimmerman verdict in the Trayvon Martin case. We did have a TV station here in Phoenix, which has a good sized African American community, but it's not as easy to find the members of that community as it sometimes is in other cities. And one of the stations had gone to a chicken and waffles restaurant looking for reaction, and one of the business paper wrote an editorial 3 days later that said that was not a good idea. And the thing is that nobody in the station thought it was a bad idea. They were not happy with how the story was, one or two things about how the story was presented. But, it was the call for that person to say, I need people in that community. Where am I going to find them, at 7 o'clock on a Saturday night or whenever it was that came down. But, it's the frustrating thing that you run into in the newsroom sometimes is that sometimes there is only one place to go. If you're on a breaking news story, the only angle you're going to get is from the police department or later from the prosecutor, because any good defense attorney tells his or her person to keep their mouth shut. So it just gets, hopefully you might be able to get a family member of a suspect to at least give some idea about who that person is. But it's really hard in some stories to get multiple angles.
Thank you. Okay. As student journalists, what are your thoughts on the impact of the 24/7 news cycle, and also social media? You know, all of it, these past 4 years and going forward. So, how do you think that this will change the role and the work of journalists in the future? And how are you incorporating those elements into your own reporting? It was funny because Raven, that the story about the Father Sarah statue, that you reported it in the summer, so that's another element at LMU. Like when things happen in the summer, when things happen over spring break or that sort of thing. But I'm curious about the whole idea of 24/7 news. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially with social media in the way that we are kind of bombarded with information at all times, it has really worsened the situation of disinformation and kind of this mistrust we have in the objective truth, which is like one of the most troubling things to me as a journalist. I think, that like it can be hard to cut through all of the noise when there's CNN going 24 hours a day and Twitter scrolling through all day. And so I think when we as we like move forward with journalism, I think it's going to be important to really highlight the sources that are actually doing the work, right? So if we don't give the time of day to these news sources that aren't really reporting the truth or aren't really going out there and doing what they need to do. Instead, they're just like making stuff up or going off of hearsay, and like that, that needs to be called out. I think on campus, like we have two trustworthy news sources. Both of us hold each other accountable. And so just that in itself is how you can, cut through all of that. There's so much news. And so again, just building that trust and saying that we as an institution or as a news source are trustworthy and we are doing the work and holding ourselves accountable, then that's the least, like that's kind of all you can do.
Raven, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think we definitely have a different perspective at agency because we, as much as like, even if we wanted to sort of keep up with like really quick information and like reporting the news and stuff, we really can't because we just don't have the resources. Again, like we don't have any compensation for our work on an hourly basis. And so because we have limited resources and we still want to do important work, and I think there's also another conversation to be had about how marginalized people are always working to represent themselves, often without recognition or pay, but it's a different thing. I think that for us, we have to pick and choose what we're going to spend our time on, what our reporters have time for in their schedules, if they have the energy to, if the topic is like really laborious to like really look into. And I think that what I tried to do, at least amongst like our staff, is like talk about rest in a very, I guess, radical way, in that normally newsrooms are driven by deadlines. And I'm not saying we don't have any deadlines, but at the same time, I think what this past year has taught us is that there's a huge need for empathy and there's a huge need to understand the need to rest and not burn yourself out. So even if we can't necessarily report every single thing that is like breaking news, even though we really want to, and we really, 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 really love what we do, there are just some times where we cannot go on and we need to take a minute, and that should be normalized, I personally think, in workplaces. So what we do is that we're okay with putting out less content as long as it's good content. And if the facts are correct, if the information is good info is better than fast info. And I think that what Alyssa said is correct. And I think that's part of why we don't necessarily push ourselves to churn out articles, is because I'd rather us take our time with really great pieces every once in a while that are correct, and that we don't make the mistakes that maybe some 24/7 hour news cycles might, because of their urgency and emphasis on speed.
Do you worry about kind of the urgency of a story? Like, do you worry about taking on a story where it's important to get something out now versus it can wait? I'm just curious how you deal with that, because there are certain stories that are sort of the moment that you want to at least jump in on some level and then maybe do follow up, more in-depth reporting later. I'm just curious about how you handle those sorts of topics.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think for us, when there's something that we really want to break, we ask like, hey, can anybody take this? That's why we have like a big group chat where we're like, hey, anybody, please, like, can we go to this meeting, please? Or can we just like jump on? Can our copy team jump on really fast to check this article? But most times people do, because people are here, they're committed, they're excited about news, but sometimes they can't. And I'm not gonna get like upset or anything, because I understand that life happens, especially right now. Life is happening in the worst possible way right now. So ultimately, if we can't, I always tell my writers, like, if you're more important and your health is more important, like, don't worry about it. But we do try our best and we do succeed. But ultimately, I prioritize the health and the safety of my staff over urgency, I think.
Alyssa, though, there must be stories that you feel like the Loyolan has to cover. How do you feel about that?
Yes, I totally understand agency's perspective, and I agree. I think that is so important. And accuracy always comes first. We try to our best to jump on things as they come out, and we do. We'll always grab a quick news brief and then follow it up as the story develops. But if you don't have the facts straight, we're not going to publish it. And so even if that means taking the time to pause and to to redo it or to do it better. I think it can be easy to try to compete like in our heads with like a CNN or something
Yeah, but
crazy, but yeah, we're like, you have to step back and say that's not what we're here to do. Our mission is to cover these events from a student perspective. And so you can look at what we did with our E2020 coverage, where we had, news videos coming out every week. Yes, it was rigorous, but like that was something, like Raven said, we all love what we do. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life. So to me, it doesn't always feel like work. I might be in the minority for that, but I think our staff is always willing to kind of come together and say, we want to be fast and we want to be accurate. So kind of finding that balance, and then also understanding that we are coming at this from a student's perspective. So sometimes that does mean like, we don't have to get the breaking news, but we do have to go get the story about how does this news impact the student.
that's really important. I mean, I think that's really important, because that is why you're here, but then again, there are things that happen at LMU or in the LMU community that, like, you're the best people to cover it and you're the best people to break that story. But so it must be frustrating at times. Oh my God, I have a paper due and this amazing story broke. What do I do? Anyway, very interesting. Kevin, what are your thoughts about the whole 24/7 news cycle and the pressures that creates?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, when 24/7 cycle started being a phrase when CNN came along, which was a good laugh for us, because I've had the opportunity to work at both WCBS Radio and KNX in Los Angeles, which are 24/7 all news radio stations, and they've been doing it since the 60s. And I used to produce newscasts at the NBC radio network at 3:00 in the morning or 3:00 in the afternoon. So, the 24/7 cycle is what radio has done for decades.
Yeah.
But to the expectations, remember we talked earlier about the alternative press versus the mainline press. The New York Times, Daily News, and Post are daily papers. The Village Voice is a weekly.
Mm-hmm.
So taking the Sarah statue as an example, what I would expect to see from the Loyolan is a tweet that, missing Father Sarah, and then a story of about 6 or 8 inches about the fact that the statue had been moved. But then the detailed story about what this means to the Indigenous Student Union is what I expect to see in the agency a day or two later, because they have the ability to go deeper and longer than the daily would have. I also, again, to praise both of the editors in that the idea that it is always better to be second and right than first and wrong. You know, as an assignment editor, I have to report to my producers about what I think and what I know. And, you know, you can get a reporter who rolls up on a house fire and this person standing on the corner says, my two cousins live in that house and they're both dead. And the reporter who gets on the air and says, you know, I'm standing in front of this double fatal house fire, who then gets the briefing from the fire chief, who reports that the fire started in the kitchen. The neighbor called 911, and it's a good thing the neighbor did because the house was empty. Now has to get on the air and say, I'm sorry, I told you that two people were dead in this house that turned out to be empty. You wait for the fire chief to tell you whether or not there are two victims in the house. Because you know, sometimes that adrenaline gets going and you really want to tell the story, but you have to put on the brakes. And, you know, those are the very important lessons that student journalists learn now, so they don't have to sit down and explain to a boss later how they jumped the gun.
Got it. Okay, I have some more questions. I'm going to jump into this one. What is the balance between being accountable to your student colleagues, to the administration, and to the parents who are sending their students off to college and are not always able to stay in touch with what's going on within the community? So how do you balance the various constituencies, and how does that affect your reporting? Alyssa, you want to take that one first, since you sort of have the bigger portfolio, if you will?
Absolutely. I think I'm it's easy, you know, first and foremost, we serve the students, right? So our mission statement is for the students. We understand that our paper is a greater community paper, and the work that we put out does impact the LMU community as a whole. But, you know, with our mission, we do strive to make sure we are representing the voice of the students, not the voice of the administration or the parents or whatever. I think, you know, it's easy to kind of get caught up in the fact that, you know, the Loyolan is connected to the institution in the sense of we are part of Loyola Marymount, but, you know, we have a policy and we have very clear guidelines that, you know, prevent mandatory review, and we have an advisor that serves as a resource in a way to make sure every student is feeling empowered in a way. So I think, you know, again, it just comes down to responsibility. Our voice is the voice of the students, but you just have to acknowledge the impact that what we publish can have on the greater community. So we really just lean into that responsibility.
Yeah, definitely agreed. I think our reporting, both agency and the Loyolans, are dedicated to the students first. I mean, the motto that we chose for ourselves was "Loyal to the Lions," and it's something I'm very proud of. I think we're all pretty proud of. It sounds really nice, and I take that very seriously. We both do, and all of our colleagues do as well. I mean, like, if parents read us, that's cool. If faculty reads us, that's even cooler. If admin reads us, wow, I'm surprised. But, you know, everything is for the students first, and that's what we think about. If we attract other people, that's awesome. I actually didn't think we were read by anybody else than the students until, like, I think a friend of mine, or like her mom, like emailed me and was like, "This is such a good article," and I was like, "Oh, hi." Like, you know, I forget that happens sometimes. So that's why this question is a fun reminder of how our audience is always bigger than we think it is, but our obligation to the truth is ultimately what matters, and that our reach will know, like, we'll go farther than we'll ever realize, and that our work, if it's good, will always be recognized by multiple audiences.
I will say that since student newspapers went online quite some time ago, it totally changed the dynamic because, parents can now read that newspaper and parents can read all about LMU all the time if they want to. And alumni can as well. So it's very easy for people who are interested in Loyola Marymount University to find out what's going on at LMU through your online publications. So your reach is much wider than it was in the old paper newspaper only days, or even paper dominant newspaper days, So keep that in mind. And don't be surprised when people are like sharing everything you write. Kevin, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, as they are correct that they are the voice of, by, and for the student body. And, if parents are now have access to it, if prospective students now have access to it, I mean, that's generally a good thing because you want them, the choice of where to go to school is a really important one. The parents, especially who, sending their progeny off to big city Los Angeles, uh, don't necessarily realize what a nice oasis in the city the campus can be when we actually get to be on the campus. And this kind of helps reassure them that yes, the campus is a community, the campus is an active place to be, the campus is not without its problems, but the students also have a say. They have a voice in, making their concerns known or keeping an eye on the administration and things like that. So that's, as we talked about target marketing earlier. The target market is the students. Anybody else you can get is great.
One thing I will say though, in the area of recruitment of faculty and staff to LMU, I'm an Angelino, but I was living in Indiana when I applied to be the dean of the library at LMU. And the first thing I did was read the Loyolan online. And because I had heard of LMU and I knew something about it, but I was not particularly familiar with its present day iteration. And so I actually did a lot of reading of the Loyolan online, and now I would read Agency LMU as well. I mean, it's a place where people go to find out what that university is like. What's the perspective of students? What do they care about? What do they write about? What are the issues they cover? Because I had a lot of questions about what kind of place is LMU, and the newspaper was it was a very good window onto the experience of at least some students and just the way they cover both the LMU itself and the LMU community in Los Angeles at large. So I do think those publications have broader value and broader audiences than you might think, particularly when people are thinking about not only prospective students, but prospective faculty and staff. And when we're trying to recruit faculty and staff of color, they're going to go looking for those news outlets and they're going to go to try to find out what is that climate at LMU and how do those publications reflect the climate at LMU and represent the climate at LMU. So they're very important publications, well beyond, the narrow focus of the students and those who work and live at LMU. So final question, I think, because we're getting ready to talk, to open up to the questions that we received. How can we trust the information that you present in your publications? How do you establish your credibility as journalists and as an information source? Thoughts, Alyssa, Raven?
I'll let Raven go first on this one.
Okay. So I think the way I want to approach this question is that I don't think there's anything I could 100% say to like get your trust immediately. I think we obviously live in a time where people pick and choose where they get their news and what they consider to be news and what they consider to be facts. But what I can offer in terms of an answer to this question is that agency is and always has been a labor of love. This is sort of me shouting out the 20 plus amazing people that have been on the team from the beginning since a year ago. And I can tell you for certain that we do not get paid enough to do this. All right. Like we don't have, again, and I hate to bring this up, but like, we don't have a salary. We aren't paid, but we put countless hours into the work that we do because we believe in the mission that we wrote for ourselves. We don't stand to gain any kind of sponsorship, any kind of backing, any kind of financial support from the university. We don't stand to gain any kind of recognition really because we're a very small publication, but we do it because we really love it. We stay up late when we can and we put out articles to break that story when we can because we really love it. We love the rush. We love to put out content that we are genuinely proud of and could see ourselves reading years from now and being like, wow, we did that. Or just being able to say that we did our job. We can't say anything that will 100% convince you, and it will be a leap of faith, but we can offer our commitment to the cause and how our love for the community drives us above all else. And so that's really the only way I can think of answering this question.
Your thoughts, Alyssa?
Yes, and I love that. And I think it is so true in acknowledging that at the end of the day, all of us are here because we love it, because this is what we love to do. Not every person that enters the Loyolan's newsroom ends up with the goal of being the next Pulitzer Prize journalist, but we all, believe in the founding ethics of journalism, which is to represent, the voices we are here to represent and to be loyal to the truth. And to, that's all we can do, right? And so I feel like, trust is a two-way street, and we do all we can to make sure that we remain accurate. We hold ourselves accountable. If we make a mistake, we acknowledge it. We add a correction. We say, hey, we messed up. We're not perfect, but let's continue to move forward. I think remaining accessible to the students all on campus is really important. I know at Loy, we're always working to improve our accessibility because, again, we've, been around a long time and sometimes things kind of get outdated. So making sure, we're reaching out to clubs or reaching out to underrepresented populations, we are empowering those in our newsroom. And I think at the end of the day, if we are working hard, if we have our hearts behind it, and we are, like Raven said, trying our best, staying up late, doing the work that we love, then that trust will grow. It's not always easy. I think right now we've realized that journalists have a lot to do to try to gain that trust back, but it's a fight that I think we're all willing to fight. So
we're all up for it. You're up for it. You're up to the challenge. Kevin, you've said that the challenge in journalism is presenting the truth when certain members of the audience refuse to believe it. What recommendations would you have to address these challenges for our students, for our communities?
Well, first of all, Alyssa hit on a very important word, correction. Journalists are human. We make mistakes. Could be as simple as misspelling the name of the student we talked to yesterday, or something bigger. But either way, you come back as soon as possible and you make the correction. One of the words that we have heard way too often in the last 5 years is fake news. And if a mistake is not fake news, a mistake is an error. Fake news is just making up something or coming to a totally wrong conclusion. What we run into, though, is two things. First of all, the rise of partisan media, which was something that Wolf Blitzer discussed in the previous session. When you have people who only listen to people who believe and think the way that they do, their partisanship becomes deeper. And what you end up getting is a knowledge ghetto, a idea that I know everything I need to know because these people are telling me everything I need to know, rather than the broader view. The other thing that you face, and this is, if you're not familiar, there is a very large longitudinal study done every year called the General Social Survey. And when you are researching just about anything, the GSS may have an answer for you. And what the GSS does periodically is it asks questions about people's confidence in the press. And when you look at this longitudinal chart, this is every 10 years starting in 1974. And then the most recent survey numbers available of 2018. You see that the number of people who had a great deal of confidence in the press kept shrinking. And the number of people who had only some was dropping because the number of people who had hardly any kept rising. So this is a scary thought when you consider that this is generalizable to the population, that any news organization has a very big fight on its hands.
Yeah. Kevin, what's interesting about that, though, is that's pretty, goes back pretty far. I think we think of this as lack of trust in the press as being a recent phenomenon, but that sort of indicates that it's been on a kind of a slow downward for 25 years, frankly.
Right. And, part of that does go to, if you want to go back, you go back 40 years, go back to 1980. And what you see, if you consider 1980 the 0 year, that is when we started getting the rise of the partisan broadcasting, in part through the end of the Fairness Doctrine and the public service requirements. You get the idea of certain high-ranking government officials questioning the media, reinforcing the idea of trust in the media or distrust in the media. So, we have to earn that trust every day. And, that's why it's really incumbent upon us to get the story right and get as much of it out there as possible.
Interesting. So someone just posed the question, should they reinstate the Fairness Doctrine? What do you think about that?
It's a question that I have been pondering myself for a while. And I think what we've seen, unfortunately, especially since the 1996 Telecommunications Act, is that the folks who operate broadcast outlets don't always recognize what what is their obligation to their community. And so we have the rise of the radio station that is nothing but a satellite dish connected to a tower. And there is no studio. There is no local news. There is no local show. It is the only thing that's local on it is the commercials. And the idea of, the most valuable piece of real estate that we own as Americans is the airwaves. And broadcasters don't own the airwaves. Broadcasters have a license to use them, going back to the Radio Act of 1927 that said that broadcasters must operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. And do you remind broadcasters of that by reinstating the Fairness Doctrine or by requiring a certain amount of locally produced content when a station is on the air? That, the localism idea might go better than the Fairness Doctrine. We have to see what goes on. We just went through the political season, and I would get phone calls from people. Why are you running that ad? That's a total lie. And we're running that ad because we have to. I have, my sales department standards and practices team can cancel out an ad from a car dealer that doesn't reveal the proper financial arrangements, or, not take an ad from a gentleman's club because we don't want that on a local television station. But with the political ads, Section 315, I am prohibited from exercising any censorship over what's in those ads because those candidates have strong First Amendment rights.
Yeah.
I have to just run it as it goes.
Interesting. I think that in the environment in which we find ourselves, I'm not sure that a fairness doctrine would make any difference at all. But that's just from my voracious news consumption. I have a question from our audience. Many professional organizations are rethinking their code of ethics based on the events of this past year. Is that happening in journalism circles? Are they being discussed in your student publications and then in the classroom? Raven or Alyssa first?
I'll go first. I'll give you a break, Alyssa. I think absolutely. I think there is a lot of conversation, especially like saying the AP style book, they and them was like properly recognized as a singular pronoun for a person. Those are the pronouns that I use. So that was a big moment for me and people like me. I think, capitalizing the B in Black, the I in Indigenous, small moves like that are being made to really regular or normalize the prioritization and the recognition of people of color and marginalized folks in journalism. You learn a lot about it in classes. Those things are enforced as well. Like, oh, like this is wrong, make sure you do that. Or like, this is like stylistically the correct way to do it. So I think in my experience as a super new alum in my journalism education, it's definitely been talked about. The ethics of, I would say, even photojournalism, especially over the past summer, were discussed a lot, not just in the regular news sphere, but they came up a lot in my fall semester right after that. So last fall, journalism curriculum, I think, definitely changed and read the room. And
could you talk about that a little bit? Could you kind of illuminate what those issues are?
Yeah, I mean, there is a big discussion, I think, with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement about photographing protests, because there is an ethical issue of putting the faces of protesters in them, because sometimes those people go missing afterwards, and they could get like arrested for just being there and having the, exercising their right to protest. So, I mean, that was like a conversation had on multiple levels, not just on the mainstream level, but also students. And so I remember learning a lot about that in my classes, or just having a general better consciousness of addressing current events in an academic setting.
Yeah, I mean, we've even talked about photographs at events in the library. Do we publish, photos of the people who attended events in the library? I mean, some of those events may be a place where they don't want their photo publicized or on our website or in a publication. So
I think it emphasized the importance of consent, right?
Yeah,
like when
yeah.
you are a visual journalist and making sure you have not just consent in general, but active consent. Like, are you sure you're okay with this? This is what this means, and explaining what that means or what the implications of giving your consent to be photographed or videoed means. So yeah.
But see, I think that that's new, because I think that it used to be, well, you're in a public place and and they don't have an obligation to ask you if they can take your photo or use your photo because they're in public. But I think it's an ethical issue. And I think it's a newly raised ethical issue in many cases. Alyssa, do you have thoughts about this? Kind of the
Yes,
whole
absolutely.
ethics and the changing ethics and the way it affects student journalists and others?
Yeah, I think this year has really brought forward those conversations, especially I know like at the Loyolan specifically after the events of this summer, we really banded together to say, okay, we're seeing all of this happening. The Loyolan, we've been around 100 years, so I'm sure when the Loyolan started, I probably wouldn't be EIC, you know what I mean? So I think acknowledging, how do we acknowledge our past, reconcile with it, and then move forward in the future? And so we started a group called Equity, Inclusion, and Pluralism at the Loyolan. That's something that I'm really passionate about. I was, one of the founding members and helped lead it. And it's not only changing some of our structures, so we modernized our style guide and our terms that we use to refer to people's ethnicity, or making sure that every reporter knows you need to ask someone's when you ask their name, ask their pronouns, like make sure we're referring to everyone how and representing people correctly. And then also though, we are introducing these important conversations in the newsroom, not just saying do this, but saying here's why we do this. Here's why it's important to capitalize the B in Black or the I in Indigenous. Here's why we use BIPOC instead of people of color. Like things like that, where sometimes you might, hand a reporter some rules and say, follow this, this is our style guide. But you really, I think once we have those conversations and start introducing and challenging kind of preconceived notions about our ethics, we can really start to see the change that's genuine, right? Because once you change the reporter, then that impacts the coverage that we're having. So if we really, I think it starts with conversation. It starts with making sure every person feels empowered to bring forward any issues and we talk about them. So yeah. And I think, sorry to keep going, but the issue of photos I think is really important too. I know when we were covering the BLM protest in Playa Vista, we had a lot of internal conversations about how do we do this in a way that still remains true to our purpose of being a news gathering source and documenting history, right? Like this is a historic moment, but also respecting people and understanding that safety comes first and we don't want to put anyone in danger. So I think we found a really great solution of saying, taking photos, but still saying we're going to pose you and say, so in that action of having the person have that agency of being represented instead of just, snapping a picture and posting it online. So yeah, I think we're at a turning point, but I have a lot of hope, and especially seeing some of the work we've done and the conversations we've had, I think we are really working to modernize and to revolutionize journalism.
It demands nothing less. Kevin, what about the classroom? When you teach, do you teach about these sort of ethical issues and also sort of the changing ethics of journalism? Because it does seem that things are in flux.
It does, but there's just a lot of pieces here. If somebody is in a public place, then they do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy. So it comes down to the outlet to decide what does that really mean. Most television newsrooms that I am familiar with, if they are shooting video of a schoolyard, they will shoot it at a distance so that the children are not identifiable. And or in other ways. It was funny to be at a junior high school PTO meet the principal day, and some of the mothers were concerned about the length of shorts that the girls were wearing that year. And she complained that she had seen a piece of news video on the TV station 2 days earlier that showed all these girls in really short shorts. And I'm like, well, yeah, because I didn't say it in the meeting, but because we were only shooting them from the back and down, if they were following their training. So, there's a certain amount of, there are ethics rules about, what you shoot, what you don't shoot. And of course, they vary from country to country. But in the United States, it's if you're in a public place, then you are certainly able to be photographed. You have to think about those, as Alyssa and Raven said. Is there an implication here? And you can try to say, we'll do our best to not shoot you in a way that you can be recognized. But also, if it's a big enough event, just because you're not recognizable in the Loyolan doesn't mean you're not going to be recognizable in the LA Times.
Mm.
So it's just one of those very, it's one of those very gray areas that you got to be very careful about. Don't make a promise that you might not be able to keep.
Interesting. So Alyssa and Raven, do you actually have written ethical policies related to these issues? And do you publish those policies? And so could someone see them on your sites? Just curious. Alyssa, you're shaking, yeah?
Yeah, we do have like best practices guidelines, both specific to the Loyolan and to like LMU student media in general, so like the yearbook and such. Yeah, I mean, they're living documents. And so as Kevin mentioned, it's a gray area, but I think, you know, that's kind of our purpose as student journalists to really challenge what is being held as the standard and say, is there a way that we could do this better? And we kind of have that wiggle room, right? As because we're still learning at the end of the day to challenge and see if we can create something better. And if not, we don't. But yeah.
I love that. I think it's a good idea. I think it's a good way to do it. Raven, what is how is this handled in Agency LMU? Are there written documents and published guidelines and ethics?
We're working on it. I think because we haven't really existed for too long, we haven't had a chance to really sit down. We've been kind of just relying on the conversations we have with each other to keep each other accountable. Like, hey, like, what is the implication of us making this reporting choice? And we try to make it a organization-wide discussion, but that actually is a project that I've been meaning to put us on. I'm thinking once we have successors in terms of the editor position, since many of us are seniors, that we can sit down with them and really put something out there on our website and kind of, I guess, solidify our place in LMU's history by doing that. So it's a great reminder that that's important to do.
Very interesting. And then when you go out into the professional world looking for jobs, I mean, are these the sorts of questions that you'll ask of the news organizations for whom you might work? I'm just curious how important these sorts of issues are to you as you go forward in your professions. Or are you just
I
going
can.
to how do you handle that? You know, do you ask those questions? I don't know.
I mean, I think obviously I'm still a student. I'm a sophomore.
Yeah,
But
I mean, you have a ways to go, Alyssa. It's more pressing for Raven.
Yeah. So I will say though, I think like especially after this summer, I felt really impassioned, right, to go after organizations that I knew represented the values I have. So like Minnesota has a local women's magazine that's by women for women. So I interned for them for a little bit. Or like the show Black Love is challenging the representations of Black people in media, right? So there's ways that you can either find organizations to get those skills and say, here's how these companies are doing it. And then as a student, right, I can bring that back to the Loyolan and create that change that I think we need to have. And I'm sure Raven, like the work you're doing in agency is something that is transmittable to your professional career. So I'm excited to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think could you restate the question actually, just so I make sure that I answer it?
I was just curious if these are the sorts of issues that you will be considering as you seek employment.
Yes.
You know, in the organizations for whom you want to work, with whom you want to work. Do you ask these sort of ethical questions? Are you curious about these sorts of issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think especially as somebody who goes by they and them pronouns and identifies as non-binary, that's a really important part of looking at an application. So if an application like asks for your pronouns, it's a huge plus for me, and that's important. That means that I would feel safe there and that I would feel respected there. I'm very grateful to be employed at a company part-time that is super, super good about that and always asks for that upfront when hiring. So that's like really awesome. But ultimately, because like I think both me and Alyssa can relate, like if we don't feel like we're going to be respected somewhere, we're not going to work there. If we don't feel like they're going to respect people who look like us either, then we're not going to work there. I think that like we should be asking for the most, not just the bare minimum, you know?
Right.
So we should be able to seek employment at organizations that have the same values that we do, but also are willing to publicly stand by those values as well.
That you make an interesting point, though. It's sort of you're looking for signals, because how do you ask those overt questions? But when somebody has, you know, preferred pronouns and chosen name and things like that on the application, then that's a signal to you. I mean, that tells you something about the organization. So, okay, I'm noticing that we're out of time. I apologize. Thank you all for your participation. I thought it was a fantastic conversation, and I loved hearing all of your ideas. And I agree with the person, Marissa, who put in the chat that we're very fortunate to have two student publications that complement and reinforce one another. And it's a very rich news environment for the LMU community that you provide. So thank you. And to you, Professor Curran, for your insights and your long years of experience and seeing the changing landscape of news and bringing in the broadcast perspective. We very much appreciate it. So thank you to everyone and have a good evening.